A Korean air flight with 115 passengers on board suddenly exploded in midair, but this wasn't an accident. The cause of the explosion was a bomb that someone had placed on board. The culprit was a woman in her 20s named Kim Hyon-hui. She was forcibly transported back to Korea. Investigations revealed she was a highly trained operative who spent years preparing for this attack. But here's the shocking twist. Not long after, the South Korean government issued a special pardon for her. The reason? They decided that Kim Hyon-hui was more valuable to them alive. Today's story is about the worst aviation terror attack in South Korean history. However, strangely enough, many people continue to raise serious questions about the official story. Why is that? I'm about to break it all down for you. It's both deeply tragic and completely wrapped up in conspiracy theories. Let's dive straight into the KAL bombing case. Hello, everyone. My name is Deevajessica, and welcome to my channel. Imagine a Korean man in his 30s. We'll call him Mr. Kim. After 3 long years working in the Middle East, he is finally heading home. 3 years away from his family, pouring every ounce of himself into grueling work in the Middle East, all for a better wage. Thanks to that, he had saved up enough money to buy a small apartment in Seoul. In a few hours, he'd land in Seoul, see his wife and young daughter, have dinner together, he'd help with homework, take her to the playground, just enjoy an ordinary life. Bursting with excitement, he settles into his seat on the plane home to Seoul. But sadly, that turned out to be Mr. Kim's last trip. November 29, 1987. Korean Air Flight 858 had been cruising for 5 hours since leaving Abu Dhabi. The plane was flying over the Andaman Sea along the Myanmar-Thailand border when suddenly, the control tower received a call. On schedule for Bangkok, over. On time, position normal, over. Just 4 minutes after this brief exchange ended, then, out of nowhere, a thunderous explosion shook the heavens. The plane lost control immediately. The passengers were in total chaos. Before anyone could grasp what was happening, the entire aircraft disintegrated right there in mid-air. And just like that, it disappeared from radar without a trace. The broken pieces of the plane flew apart and crashed into the ocean. Among them were 88 Koreans and 20 crew members. Out of 115 souls aboard that Korean airplane, no one survived. Not even one person. This particular flight originally took off from Iraq. It had scheduled stops in Abu Dhabi and Bangkok. With Seoul as its final destination, the plane was destroyed moments before landing in Bangkok. Most of the passengers were Korean workers finishing their contracts at Middle Eastern construction sites and heading home. Each of those victims was someone's father, husband, or son, and none of them ever made it home to Seoul. As the breaking news spread rapidly, the South Korean government responded immediately. But first, why exactly did the plane fall out of the sky? The investigative team turned its attention to the aircraft's transit stop in Abu Dhabi. What if someone deliberately planted explosives on board? They then began investigating which passengers had boarded and disembarked along the way. They identified 15 passengers who had been on the flight all the way to Abu Dhabi, but never boarded for Bangkok. They went through each person's background, top to bottom. Turns out, most of them were just foreign workers who lived in Abu Dhabi. In other words, they simply got off in Abu Dhabi and went home. The Korean intelligence agency was methodically removing names from the list. When all was said and done, 2 very suspicious people came to light. One was a 70-year-old Japanese man, Hachiya Shinichi, and the other, his 25-year-old daughter, Hachiya Mayumi. Immediately upon arriving in Abu Dhabi, they changed where they were headed. That was odd. They had bought tickets to Jordan, but out of nowhere, they headed to Bahrain instead. Korean intelligence wasted no time and requested Bahrain's cooperation. 2 days into the disaster, on the morning of December 1st, with no idea that South Korea had them in their sights, this Japanese father and daughter walked into the Bahrain airport. Their next destination was meant to be Rome. They dropped off their bags at the check-in desk and were waiting for passport control. All of a sudden, investigators and Japanese officials were surrounding them. Korea wasn't taking any chances. They had already asked for an ID check on these two. Bahraini investigators stepped up and asked the obvious, "What exactly are you two doing here in Bahrain?" They recite a story like they'd rehearsed it 1,000 times. Just a father and daughter vacation, Iraq, Abu Dhabi, Bahrain, and next stop, Rome. A perfectly rehearsed itinerary. It could have sounded ordinary, but the investigators picked up on something suspicious. Don't forget the backdrop here. The war between Iran and Iraq was in full swing. People were being advised to avoid traveling to such dangerous regions. But somehow a Japanese father and daughter are just calmly traveling through the Middle East. The whole premise made no sense. That's when the Japanese embassy stepped in. They started by checking their passports. And sure enough, both the names and passport numbers were completely fake. They hadn't even bothered to match the official font. Anyone could see they were fake. Next, the embassy officials decided to test them with some small talk. Just basic stuff like, where do you live in Japan? Has the trip been going smoothly so far? But the look of panic on both their faces was unmistakable. They fumbled over their words, unable to answer properly. They did speak a few words of Japanese, but to a native ear, they clearly weren't from Japan. So, were they actually a father and daughter? In the eyes of the staff watching, these two gave off zero family energy. If they were really family, he would have stepped up to protect her the moment those agents approached. But they just seemed completely disconnected. The airport police decided it was time to move them to the office. They needed to get to the bottom of this, so they moved to escort the pair, but right at that moment, without a word, Shinichi sent Mayumi a covert signal. They exchanged a glance, and at exactly the same moment, each pulled out a Marlboro cigarette and put it to their mouth. They bit down on the filter, and the cyanide capsule inside broke open and released the poison. The police saw what was happening and jumped in to intervene, but they were too late. The poison moved quickly through their systems. At his age, Shinichi didn't stand a chance. He collapsed on the floor and died on the spot. But the officer next to Mayumi acted fast. He put his fingers in her mouth and pulled out the broken capsule. Thanks to that, only a tiny amount of poison got into her body, and Mayumi was rushed to a hospital in Bahrain. The moment they reached for those capsules, any remaining doubt simply vanished for good. These were terrorists, and this was all the proof they needed. So who gave the order, and more importantly, who was truly behind it all? And why specifically choose a Japanese cover? Shinichi had taken his secrets to the grave. Now Mayumi was the sole surviving key to this case. The South Korean government heard Mayumi was caught and immediately moved to bring her back. Technically speaking, they traveled on fake Japanese documents, which meant Japan was where they belonged. Once Japan recognized the transnational nature of the attack, negotiations moved quickly and they approved her transfer to South Korea. 2 weeks after the incident, on December 15, 1987, the whole country was furious, and now Mayumi had finally arrived in Seoul to face it all. It was televised live in real time, and every single person in the country was watching. Now, this date wasn't just any ordinary day in Korean history. The very next day, South Korea would hold its first ever direct presidential election, a milestone for the country. I mention this because of the conspiracy theories coming up later. But anyway, there was Mayumi, stepping off the plane with her mouth gagged. Those who watched it live were left with a strangely unsettling shock they couldn't quite explain. That small, delicate, pretty woman over there, she's the one who killed 115 people? It was anger and hatred all at once, but also, just who exactly is that woman? It was a strange blend of emotions all mixed together with curiosity. When you think of a terrorist, you picture someone threatening. But Mayumi was nothing like that. She was just a young woman. You won't believe the next day's newspaper headlines. Headlines like "Beautiful Terrorist Captured Now in Seoul" were everywhere. Heavily guarded, Mayumi was dragged to the intelligence agency. Now, the real interrogation begins to uncover her true nationality. First off, it turned out she wasn't Japanese. Out of nowhere, Mayumi insisted that she was actually Chinese. She even spoke some of the language. So they brought in a Chinese interpreter and resumed the interrogation. And soon enough, something truly dramatic happened. The interpreter asks her in Chinese, "If you're truly Chinese, then where's your hometown? What did you do back in China? And who exactly is that man you were with?" To every question they asked, Mayumi gave only the shortest possible answers. She refused to give any details. Naturally, the interpreter got frustrated. So he whispers to the agent in Korean, just quietly, "Hey, I think this woman is lying." But the moment she heard that, Mayumi's expression changed, just barely. And she responded in Chinese, loud and clear, "I'm telling the truth." Did you catch that? The interpreter said it in Korean, yet Mayumi heard it, understood it, and responded in Chinese. Instantly, dead silence filled the room. Mayumi knew she had made a mistake, and the interrogators were now absolutely certain she could understand Korean. The real question now was, who exactly was this woman? The questioning just keeps going. The agency put a lot of pressure on her, but Mayumi just wouldn't talk, not for days. And so the agents shifted their strategy. Without explanation, they put her in a car and drove her through the streets of Seoul. Now, I know what you're thinking, that seems completely out of nowhere. But actually, it was a highly calculated mind game. The year was drawing to a close, and the streets buzzed with life. Children holding parents' hands, laughing as they walked. Young couples enjoying intimate dates. Watching it with her own eyes, Mayumi began to fall apart inside. Happy people everywhere, Mayumi stared at all of it. She had never imagined anything like this. Her face showed how confused she felt inside. Back at the agency, she sat quietly for a long time with a stiff face, deep in thought. After 8 long days of interrogation, Mayumi finally revealed her true identity. The truth is, I'm from North Korea. Her real name was Kim Hyon-hui. The man who had died earlier, his real name was Kim Sung-il. As it turned out, the two of them had been North Korean operatives, trained for years. And the investigators had already expected this. But that raises the question, why would North Korea target a South Korean plane at this particular moment? At the root of it all was a burning inferiority complex and a growing sense of anxiety. After the Korean War, North and South Korea each took a completely different path. But over time, the economic gap between them grew very large. The South became much wealthier. For North Korea, this inevitably became a major source of worry. And now even the mood around the world was changing. South Korea had just won the bid to host the 1988 Olympics. In other words, they had moved past the war and were now growing into a fully developed country. To make it worse, even China and the Soviet Union, countries North Korea thought were on their side, said they were going to the Olympics. As the spirit of unity grew, North Korea became very anxious, and they chose a despicable method to stop it. They fed lies to the global press, saying things like, "Do you have any idea how unstable South Korea is?" And they whispered that war was just around the corner. They were desperate. But of course, cheap lies like that were never going to work. Then they took it further with a major attack. They attempted a terror attack on the South Korean president while he was visiting Myanmar. They wanted to destabilize the entire South. 17 people were killed in that blast, and 14 others were badly injured. But ultimately, they failed to kill the president. I've given you the short version, but you can imagine the extreme tension between North and South at the time. And right in the middle of all this, the KL bombing struck on November 29, 1987. Now let's go back to Kim Hyon-hui. The North Korean government invested years preparing her for exactly this. Her father's high-ranking role in the North Korean Foreign Ministry meant Kim Hyon-hui enjoyed a comfortable, privileged childhood. She enrolled in the Japanese department at Pyongyang University of Foreign Languages. Her sharp intellect and striking looks made her stand out early on, and she was soon handpicked as a key talent. In 1980, 7 years before the attack, Hyon-hui was recruited and selected as an undercover agent. Over the course of a year, she underwent thorough brainwashing and training. She had been remade into a spy whose only allegiance was to the North Korean organization. Her formal training began in 1981 and lasted for 2 full years. So what exactly was involved? She was made to live with a Japanese agent to master the language. When she reached a functional level, 18 months of practical skills began, including photography, encrypted communications, and various other practical techniques. After finishing all of that, real-world operational training began. She was paired with Kim Sung-il to form a father-daughter operative unit. For 3 years, they traveled through various European countries, including Austria, Denmark, Germany, Switzerland, and France. Their training focused on slipping across borders unnoticed while disguised as someone else. Now, here's where things get interesting. It came to light that Kim Sung-il had secretly snuck all the way into Seoul back in September 1984. He had even booked himself into a luxury hotel and stayed for 6 days. Everything they had done up to this point was just preparation. Then they headed back to Pyongyang. Next came 6 months of intensive Chinese language training, first Japanese and now Chinese. After that, 18 more months were spent in mainland China and Macau, perfecting their ability to pose as locals. Let's put this all together for a moment. They spent years learning languages and adapting to life in other countries. And just like that, a highly refined killing machine had been created. And then, 19 days before the KAL bombing, the mission order finally arrived. To stop nations from attending the Seoul Olympics, they were ordered to blow up a Korean air passenger plane. The intention was clear: create fear and unease about Korea across the entire world. That was the goal. They chose Flight 858 with cold, calculated precision as their target. If multiple countries' citizens had been on board and North Korea was found responsible, the international fallout would have been devastating. So they targeted a flight filled almost exclusively with South Koreans. The operation began immediately after they received their orders. They departed Pyongyang and made their way through Moscow and Budapest. 6 days later, they arrived in Vienna, Austria. Notice the route? All of those countries were either friendly to the north or neutral. And why Austria specifically? North Korea had an embassy there. Think of it as the central hub for all of North Korea's espionage and surveillance activities across the continent. There, the pair were carefully handed Japanese passports to use as cover. Kim Hyon-hui became Mayumi, and Kim Sung-il became Shinichi. Next stop, Serbia. They just kept bouncing from country to country. In Serbia, they linked up with a North Korean contact by the name of Chief Choi. From Choi, they received a Panasonic radio and a bottle of whiskey. What were they hiding? Both were bombs. These were far from ordinary objects. What was packed inside was so powerful that even a small amount could bring down an entire building in seconds. To be precise, the radio hid military-grade C4 explosives inside, and the whiskey bottle held a potent liquid explosive, which was designed specifically to slip past metal detectors. The radio had a timer carefully built right into it. Once activated, they had exactly 9 hours before the whole thing blew sky high. Their plan was deliberately designed to detonate the bomb while the plane was still flying over the open sea. November 28, 11 p.m. The pair boarded Korean Air Flight 858 in Iraq. Just before they boarded, Kim Sung-il activated the bomb hidden inside the shopping bag. As naturally as they could, they placed the shopping bag in the overhead bin right above seat 7. At 2:44 a.m. the next day, the flight arrived in Abu Dhabi exactly as scheduled. And right there, the two of them slipped off the plane, leaving the shopping bag exactly where it was. But here's something that just doesn't make sense. Even on a connecting flight, security should sweep the plane for left-behind items. It's a basic rule. But for some unknown reason, a proper cabin check simply didn't take place that night. It's a detail that has fueled conspiracy theories for decades. In the end, the plane departed for Bangkok with the bomb still on board. And somewhere in the skies, it met a tragic end. But while the bomb did its work, the two terrorists were running into serious trouble of their own. The original plan was to get off in Abu Dhabi and fly straight to Jordan, and then return to Pyongyang as heroes. But an unforeseen problem suddenly came up. At the check-in counter, a staff member quietly warned them that Jordan's entry process was incredibly tough and strict right now because of the ongoing war. Since they were flying in from Iraq, every single one of their documents would be checked thoroughly and carefully, and there was a genuine, very real chance they'd be turned away right at the border. That level of attention was the last thing they needed, so Kim Sung-il hurried to get their tickets changed. He desperately asked the staff, "Where else can we go? What flight is leaving right now?" The agent suggested a flight to Bahrain, so they headed to that unexpected place, and that's where they got caught. If everything had gone smoothly, we might still not know who was behind this terror attack. The mystery might have stayed buried. Back in South Korea, the survivor, Kim Hyon-hui, faced a historic trial. But the trial wasn't the biggest shock. Nothing could have prepared her for what South Korea actually looked like. According to what she had been brainwashed to believe, South Korea was a place riddled with hunger, where people barely survived through begging and prostitution. But the reality was completely different. People were all eating better and living better than in North Korea. She had been nothing more than a tool manipulated from the very beginning. But she had already become a terrorist who had taken the lives of 115 people. All across the country, people wanted to see her get the punishment she deserved. But then the story took a turn no one expected. In March 1990, the court sentenced her to death. Even if North Korea had ordered it, she was still held responsible for the attack. But only 16 days after her death sentence was announced, the government stepped in and granted her a full special pardon. The execution was called off. She was a free woman. What does that mean? The whole country was angry. A terrorist walking free? But the new government, led by President Roh Tae-woo, stood firm on his decision. Why had they pardoned her? There were about 3 main reasons for this. First, they decided she was more valuable alive than dead. They believed that using her to expose North Korea's brutality to the world served the national interest. Second, the real mastermind was the North Korean regime all along. It was too harsh to put all the blame on a young woman who had been brainwashed her whole life and then execute her. And the third reason, allowing Kim Hyon-hui to stay and live in South Korea. It showed the world that South Korea could forgive even a terrorist. They thought it would spread a positive image of South Korea to the world. When you look at it logically, it actually makes a lot of sense. But can you imagine how the victims' families took this? She was the one who took their loved ones away. Of course, they were furious. But in the end, they couldn't stop the government's decision. She survived by a thread and started a new life in South Korea, protected by the government. She adjusted quickly and soon began exposing what North Korea was really like. She also published 2 books telling the full story of the KAL bombing. She gave national security talks across the country and appeared frequently in the media. By the way, 10 years after settling in South Korea, she married a former government agent and reportedly had 2 children together. I'm curious how all of you feel about this part of the story. Like it or not, Kim Hyon-hui genuinely helped South Korea. North Koreans who risked absolutely everything to escape to the South said that hearing she was alive and living a normal life there was one of the biggest reasons they decided to leave. So there was no doubt about it. Keeping her alive and well in South Korea was the right decision. She completely transformed into a South Korean citizen. She was useful to the government, but at the same time, she is the person who killed 115 innocent people. That truth does not just disappear. But here's the dark turn. The true mystery, the climax of this case, starts right now. The truth is, the KL bombing has always been surrounded by unanswered questions and never-ending conspiracy theories. So what exactly is the conspiracy? Let me explain. Well, according to one theory, the plane crash was originally caused by a simple mechanical failure. But the government wanted to use it to their political advantage and framed it as a North Korean attack. You might ask, wait, they sacrificed their own people for politics? So how exactly does that help anyone? To understand that, you have to look at the timeline. The KAL bombing happened just 17 days before the presidential election. And this wasn't just any election. It was the moment to finally end the military dictatorship and establish a new democratic government. It was pivotal. It was the first direct presidential vote in Korean history. And right before that moment, a plane explodes. To make matters worse, Kim Hyon-hui was brought in the day before the election. It creates a suspicion that the timing was orchestrated by the government. Her arrival was broadcast live to the nation, with the whole country watching her every move. It perhaps created a deep sense of national security crisis around North Korea among the public, which, when combined with the political climate of the time, ultimately worked heavily in favor of Roh Tae-woo. But does any real proof actually exist? Well, about 20 years later, a classified government document was declassified. It was a massive file, 1,600 volumes, known as the Rainbow Project. Here's what it said. Spread the word, make sure everyone knows this was North Korea's doing. Use it to create an environment favorable to candidate Roh Tae-woo. That was the order. But the terrifying part is when this was written. It was drafted just 3 days after the crash. Remember, 3 days after the crash, Kim Hyon-hui was still nowhere near Korea. She was still detained in Bahrain. Her nationality was still a mystery, and yet the government was already certain North Korea was responsible. And with that, people started to ask some very uncomfortable questions. Was this investigation ever really about justice? Or was it politically manipulated from the very beginning? And just like that, the debate exploded and spread everywhere. I mean, think about it. They just left the bomb in the overhead bin and got off. That's it. These individuals were supposedly among the most highly trained operatives in the field. Would they really leave the success of the explosion up to blind luck? It makes you wonder, because if by any chance the crew had checked the overhead shelf and removed the item from the plane, the entire plan would have failed. A detonation at Abu Dhabi airport would have caused a diplomatic disaster. But why carry out such a careless operation like this? And yet, it actually worked. How could the crew possibly miss a shopping bag left behind? That part makes no sense to me. And that's why the conspiracy theories never stopped. Maybe none of it means anything. I'd like to think that. But there is one way to get to the truth. All they'd need to do is recover the flight recorder. That ends it right there. But there's a problem. The plane came apart at altitude, hurling fragments across the sea, and to this day, the flight recorder has never been recovered. 2 weeks after the explosion, a U.S. reconnaissance plane spotted 8 pieces of wreckage floating in the sea, so Korea rushed an investigation team out there. But the currents there were too strong. Even attempting any kind of recovery work was totally out of reach. The conclusion: the flight recorder's location has been an unsolved mystery for over 30 years and counting. It's frustrating. No wonder the theories never stop. But some conspiracy theorists believe the government was deliberately dragging its feet on the investigation, avoiding the truth. But then, 3 years after the explosion in 1990, out of nowhere, local fishermen pulled a section of the plane's body from the water. The Korean government sent forensic investigators to examine it. The results showed that internal pressure inside the fuselage rose dramatically in a very short time. Experts determined the plane had been torn apart from the inside out. In other words, it was a bomb. And then the government made a decision that nobody could understand. They ordered every piece of wreckage to be thrown away. Their reasoning? We already have Kim Hyon-hui's confession. It's clearly North Korea. Why bother keeping the wreckage? They decided the budget was better spent elsewhere. And with that, the only piece of evidence was destroyed. The only thing left, the inspection report. But looking at the contents, it's so poorly done you can't help but wonder if an expert really wrote it. There weren't even any photos of the fuselage. None of that was in there. And if that wasn't enough, when the 5-year preservation window closed, the report itself was shredded, leaving nothing but a summary behind. Why would you just throw away evidence from a terror attack without a second thought? It just doesn't add up. The government moved too fast and thought too little, and all they accomplished was making the conspiracy theories harder to dismiss. That's the uncomfortable truth. Decades later, all we have is one confession, and the only device that could prove it remains lost forever. But wait, is there solid evidence that North Korea was behind this? Absolutely. It starts with the suicide attempt in Bahrain using a cyanide capsule. In the entire world, North Korea was the only country making liquid poison capsules like that. That specific cyanide capsule is practically a North Korean signature. South Korea was already sure this was no accident. They were absolutely certain it was a North Korean terror attack. After all, they had made threats before. That is why the media outlets and official documents were already confidently calling it a North Korean attack, even before anyone had confessed to anything. The most sensitive part of the conspiracy theory is the assertion that this terror attack was what changed the election results. But if you look at the facts, you can't blame it all on one thing. The two opposition candidates, Kim Young-sam and Kim Dae-jung, refused to join forces and run as one. Because they stayed split, more votes went to Roh Tae-woo, and that helped him win. On top of that, Kim Hyon-hui said the same thing every single time she was interviewed. "I did it. I was following orders from North Korea." She even revealed that because she failed her suicide mission, her family in North Korea were subjected to purging and sent to detention camps. So then, what was the official position of North Korea? They said officially they had nothing to do with it. They even said Kim Hyon-hui was not a real person. But years later, something interesting happened. At an international conference, North Korea let something slip. "We have not carried out any terror attacks since the KAL bombing." Huh? Since when? Didn't they just admit to the attack themselves? Listen. Before we wrap up, my main message today is not about figuring out the exact truth of the case or going through all the conspiracy theories. It's that in the middle of all these mysteries, we sometimes lose sight of what truly and deeply matters. 115 innocent people tragically lost their lives in this attack. And for the families left behind, that pain hasn't gone anywhere. It is still an open wound. There was a little girl who never recovered her father's remains or any of his things. Today, she would be a grown woman. Those fathers who went to the Middle East to earn money and make their families happy. And also the Korean crew members and foreign passengers on that plane. Their deaths were deeply unfair and painful, and it is a tragedy that we as a society must never forget or overlook. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode. Now, in these kinds of episodes, I mainly cover domestic crimes and murder cases. But today, I'm bringing you a special case from modern Korean history, one that is deeply unjust and it deserves to be heard. First of all, what comes to mind when you hear the words bomb attack? Your mind probably jumps straight to the Middle East or maybe some war-torn corner of Europe. It feels distant, right? Like it doesn't happen here. But Korea wasn't always this safe. Just 40 years ago, terror was very much a reality here too. Especially in the 80s, as Korea's global profile really started to rise. At the same time, North Korea was launching one attack after another. The case we're talking about today also arose from a complex political situation and ideological conflict. In today's video, I want to set aside all politics and ideology. Today we'll explore the somewhat controversial investigation process surrounding a terrorist attack and the stories of its victims. Let's go back to the year 1983. In Daegu, specifically the Samdok-dong neighborhood, there was a place called the American Cultural Center. You might not have heard of it. The American Cultural Center isn't really a thing anymore. Simply put, a cultural center is a facility created to spread the culture and language of a given country. So back in those days, it was mainly used as a place to study English. It wasn't restricted. Students, locals, anyone could walk in. You could borrow books, maybe catch a movie too. This was not a military facility. It was essentially a library, a community center. No one could have imagined that the American Cultural Center would ever become the target of a bomb attack. September 22nd, 1983, 9 o'clock at night. There was a young boy named Hyo Byung-chul, a freshman at Yeongnam High School. After school, he boarded a bus with his friends and was on his way home. Just a normal night, laughing and chatting with friends. Eventually, he gets off the bus and walks the rest of the way alone. His route took him right past the front entrance of the American Cultural Center that day. And that's when something suddenly caught his eye. Right in front of the entrance, 2 bags were just sitting there. He thought, that's weird, did someone just forget them? He was too curious to just walk away, so he went over to take a look. Before checking what was inside, he gave one of the bags a little lift. He was shocked. It was so heavy. The larger bag especially, it was so heavy that even trying to lift it alone was out of the question. Right away, something felt off. He knew this wasn't right. So he grabbed the smaller bag and ran to the police station. He told them, hey, I found this suspicious bag outside the center. And listen, there is actually another one still sitting out there. The officer who took the report was a young patrolman named Kim Hyon-hui. He took the report and said, all right, let's go check it out. Officer Kim followed the student back to the cultural center. They arrived at the front entrance at exactly 9:33 p.m. And sure enough, just like the student said, that second bag was still sitting right there. What is that? Hugh already knew what those bags looked like, so he was the first one to go closer. He reaches down to lift the bag, trying to show the officer, and in that split second, boom! A tremendous explosion erupts with a deafening roar. That night, a security guard was on overnight duty up on the second floor. He later testified that it happened around 9:36 p.m., and just like that, a huge boom comes crashing up from below. The whole building shook violently. The guard was completely shocked. What is going on? Still in a daze. Out of nowhere, a searing pain hits him in his right arm. Pieces of the bomb were stuck in his arm and blood was pouring out. The bomb went off downstairs, but fragments flew up to the second floor and cut right into his arm. That alone tells you everything you need to know about just how massive and powerful that explosion was. Just like that, the outer wall of the cultural center was completely destroyed by the explosion. Across the street, the university hospital had every single one of its windows completely shattered. 2 taxis driving by at that very moment had every single one of their windows smashed to pieces. Experts analyzed the site and concluded this wasn't just a simple bomb. The explosion was so powerful it was like setting off 35 grenades simultaneously. How did they come up with that number? The larger bag, the one that blew up, it's estimated they used 3 claymore mines. That's 2.1 kilograms of raw explosive material. A standard grenade carries about 60 grams, so this was literally 35 times more powerful. Ha and Officer Kim were the ones who took the full brutal force of that enormous explosion. Coming out of that unharmed was impossible. It's heartbreaking, but Ha lost his life right there, and Officer Kim suffered critical, life-altering injuries. Now take a close look at this photo. This is the actual bag that Hyo brought with him, the very one he carried all the way to the police station. When they opened it up right after the incident, they discovered that this bag also contained explosives inside. Luckily for everyone there, the bomb didn't work. It never exploded. Later, analysis revealed it had been converted into a time bomb. If that bomb had gone off inside the police station, the damage would have been truly enormous, and many officers could have lost their lives. That brings us to the next big question. Who placed that bomb there, and why the American Cultural Center of all places? First things first, The American Cultural Center is a protected diplomatic facility. It is exempt from Korean law and falls directly under the authority of the United States. An attack there isn't just a crime, it's a massive diplomatic crisis. The government at the time, under Chon Doo-won, feared this could cause tension with America, so they rapidly put together a joint task force. It was known as the Joint Intelligence Interrogation Unit, or HAPSINJO for short. The National Security Agency, Daegu Police, the military, and intelligence. All of them joined forces for a massive investigation. 750,000 people. That's how many they say were questioned in the search for the bomber. Now that number makes it sound like a thorough, wide-ranging investigation. But in reality, it wasn't like that at all. Turns out, the task force had already picked their suspects from the very start. Who were they targeting? Let's look at the atmosphere of the time. Anti-American sentiment was spreading among university students. Student protests were turning increasingly intense and violent. But this wasn't the first bombing. Activist students had actually done this twice before. They had already set fire to American cultural centers in other parts of the country. First Gwangju in 1980, then Busan in 1982. So the government saw a pattern. Using that pattern as their only basis, the task force hastily and recklessly concluded that this incident was also the work of anti-American student activists. Just like that, 5 students were put on the suspect list almost immediately. They were all students at Gyeongbuk National University: Park Jang-deok, An Sang-hak, Woo Sung-soo, Sun Ho-man, and Ham Jong-ho. Not even a full day after the explosion, on the 23rd, the task force had arrested all 5 students. They dragged them to a private house near the Gyeongbuk provincial office and began their interrogation. But during this process, truly illegal arrests and investigations took place that would be unimaginable by today's 2025 standards. First of all, the Joint Task Force never obtained warrants for any of them. That's illegal. No arrest warrant, no search warrant, nothing, just raw, unchecked power. They simply detained the students and illegally searched their homes under the pretense of finding evidence. Now, one of the arrested students, Sun Ho-man, stands out. At the time of the Cultural Center explosion, he wasn't even in Daegu. He was away visiting family for the Chuseok holiday on the day of the attack. On the 23rd, he returned to Daegu and was taken away by undercover agents with no explanation given. There, along with the other 4, he was subjected to merciless violence and torture. This torture went on for a full month. The beatings, abuse, and threats went on every single day. "We know you're all guilty." That was the leading interrogation they used. At the time, the Joint Task Force had quickly arrested 5 suspects. It seems they were quite confident that with enough torture, the students would confess quickly. But contrary to expectations, all 5 students refused to talk, insisting they knew nothing about it. Rather than questioning their assumptions, the task force had a different thought. We simply haven't pushed them far enough. Not long after, they brought in Lee Gun-an, a man who had built a dark reputation as one of the most feared torture specialists. The students were then transferred to the anti-communist detention facility in Wondaedong, where intense torture was carried out. Lee Gun-an was a professional torturer. I'm not sure how you'd describe that as a job, but what he brought to that room was something far darker than anything those students had already endured. The torture was unimaginably brutal. Beatings were just the starting point. They hurt their legs with wooden boards and drowned them over and over. Electric torture was used without hesitation. But the hardest part of all was when they pulled in the people closest to them, family, friends, and made it crystal clear: if you don't open your mouth, they will suffer the consequences. Looking back, every bit of it was against the law. And finally, broken by the relentless threats, all 5 students gave in. They concluded that making a false confession and accepting the sentence was the only way to get out of there alive. And so the investigation seemed to wrap up perfectly. Their confessions were forced to fit the narrative the task force had already decided on. In the process, Park Jong-deok was framed as the ringleader, and Sun Ho-man used to work in artillery when he was in the army. And just like that, they accused him. "You're the one who built the bomb, aren't you?" And the other three students, they were all thrown in as suspects too. The case seemed to be nearing its conclusion, but innocent people had been blamed. But that same year, on December 14th, an incredible truth was revealed that turned everything around. And this was carried out by North Korean agents. This was on December 3rd, 1983. Two North Korean agents were captured while infiltrating the Daegu coast in Busan. These spies were Jun Chun-nam, the leader, and Lee Sang-ju, his partner. Once captured, the two of them made it clear they wanted to come over to the south. Then on December 14th, a major press conference was held. And once the press conference was over, spy Jun Chun-nam was the one who revealed a shocking truth. Remember the Daegu Cultural Center bombing back in late September? Jun Chun-nam was in the middle of his training in Wonsan, North Korea at the time. And he says a radio operator named Park Chang-sik, who was handling all communications, came to him and told him something shocking. Park was the guy monitoring communications, and he passed along what he had intercepted. So what exactly did it say? Daegu Cultural Center bombing, mission accomplished. That's correct. The person behind the blast was never one of those 5 students. It turned out to be the work of North Korean spies all along. Now, you can't just blindly trust a spy who just walked across the border from North Korea. So after the press conference, the government ordered a reinvestigation of the case. That was the order. When they checked the physical evidence one by one, everything kept pointing straight back to North Korea. Starting with the explosives from the attack, every battery that was used in the construction of the bomb hidden inside that small bag was found to have come directly from North Korea. The chemicals in this bomb were the same as those used in the North Korean Onsan bombing in Burma, directly linking the two attacks. Every single component traced back to North Korean military explosives. Finally, the investigation starts to uncover the truth. It's now November 1984, a full year later. The Daegu Police Task Force had reached a conclusion. Ladies and gentlemen, the American Cultural Center explosion was carried out by North Korean spies. We believe the perpetrators successfully escaped back to the north after the mission. And just like that, the official investigation is closed. Why? Because the real killers were already gone. So then, what happens now to the students who were wrongly blamed for all of this? If you actually think about it, a proper forensic look at the bomb from the start, and these innocent people wouldn't have suffered like this. In fact, without that North Korean spy, they might have spent their entire lives in prison. So what do you do with them now? But of course, there's another problem. The truth was out, they were innocent, but the joint investigation team refuses to let them go. Since they could no longer hold them responsible for the bombing, they began adding new charges against them. There was no way out of this trap for them. Eventually, the case went to trial. Park Jong-deok faced the national security law. He was charged with violating the Anti-Communist Law and the Assembly and Demonstration Act. He got 3 years in prison. The remaining students were sentenced to 1 year and 6 months for violating the national security law. In his final statement, Sun Ho-man said, "Do you know what kind of torture I was subjected to during the investigation?" He protested his innocence, but the judge dismissed it entirely. In the end, none of them could escape imprisonment. Now, there is someone who has been identified as the real culprit, a North Korean agent named Lee Cho. He returned to North Korea and was decorated with the Kim Il-sung Medal for carrying out the bombing. He's likely living comfortably now. That's the reality. The real bomber is out of reach, safe and sound. But the victim, Park Jong-deok? More than 40 years have passed, and he still suffers from nightmares to this day. After being taken into that horrifying interrogation room and being tortured mercilessly, the crushing injustice left him with a trauma that would never truly fade. In 2006, Park Jong-deok finally took action. He submitted a request to the Truth Commission for a reinvestigation into the illegal detention, torture, and forced confessions. Just think about it. Just one day to arrest 5 innocent people. That's terrible police work. Even the final sentencing was handled in just 1 year with remarkable speed. And yet, the reinvestigation that could finally reveal the truth wouldn't begin until 2008, 2 long years after he first filed his request. And on top of that, the retrial didn't even open until 2018, another 12 years down the road. Finally, at that retrial, all 5 students were declared not guilty. These guys were in their 20s when it happened. Now they're over 60. That's how long it took to prove their innocence. But one of them, Woo Sung-ho, never got to see that day. He passed away before the verdict ever came. At the end of it all, Park Jong-dak was awarded government compensation. The amount he received after suffering the trauma of torture was a mere $46,000. And it turns out the American Cultural Center case had even more victims that most people never heard about. Aside from the 5 students, Lee Kyung-hoon and Lee Bo-kyung, both now deceased, were also wrongly accused of involvement in the bombing and were handed suspended sentences. Shin Chang-il was also illegally investigated, tortured, and sentenced to 18 months in prison for a crime he never committed. Thanks to a retrial held in June of 2020, Lee Kyung-hoon and Lee Bo-kyung were finally declared innocent. But both of them had already passed away. Today's story reveals how anti-communism was used to forcibly interrogate and brutally torture people, destroying the lives of so many innocent victims. In many ways, this case pulled back the curtain on one of Korea's darkest hidden sides. A history that we must ensure never repeats itself. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode.